The factors that make new entrants a greater threat to the profitability of an industry are as follows. If economies of scale are low. Why is that? Well, if economies of scale are low, then there is not much benefit in terms of cost savings for a company to be large. Pretty much 1 plus 1 plus 1 is always equaling 3 if economies of scale are low. Think about, for example, the restaurant industry. In the restaurant industry, there really is not that much benefit in terms of cost savings for a company to be large, for it to have large restaurants or even a large number of restaurants. Once you get beyond a certain size restaurant, something like 15 or 20 tables, there really isn't that much cost savings for the restaurant itself to be much larger. And since all of the costs in a restaurant are duplicated every time you open a new restaurant, there really is no cost savings from having a large number of restaurants. So the restaurant industry would be a great example of an industry where economies of scale are low. Now contrast that with an industry where economies of scale are high, such as the production of large commercial aircraft, the kind that you fly on when you're flying long distances on major airlines. In that industry, economies of scale are enormous. In fact, estimates are that the minimum efficient scale of production in large commercial aircraft is something like 25% of world demand. So, based upon that fact alone, you know that there can't possibly be any more than 4 companies surviving in the long term in the large commercial aircraft industry. In fact, there used to be 3 companies, and now there are 2. So that tells you, the economies of scale in producing large commercial aircraft are very high because there are huge fixed costs. Every time you go to develop a new model of aircraft, you have to spend literally billions of dollars in research and development before even the first aircraft is built. So in order to make that economical, that expenditure of that fixed cost of billions of dollars, you have to spread that out over a large number of aircraft. Otherwise, it's just not economical. So that's what makes the economies of scale in the large commercial aircraft industry so huge. So what does that mean? Well, if economies of scale are low, then a new entrant doesn't have to get a large percentage of the total market demand in order to survive as a viable company. On the other hand, if economies of scale are huge, like they are in the large commercial aircraft industry, then any new entrant would have to garner a huge market share in order to be a viable entrant in the industry. And that's a much higher hurdle to pass over than if economies of scale are low. And that's why new entrants are a much more serious threat to the profitability of companies in the restaurant industry than they are to companies in the large commercial aircraft industry. Another factor which increases the threat of new entrants to the profitability of an industry is if the product is undifferentiated. If you're selling in your industry an undifferentiated commodity product, then customers pretty much don't care who they buy from. Undifferentiated means it's the same across every supplier. Something like a commodity chemical like chlorine or methane or methanol. Those are fairly undifferentiated products. And so a customer might not care really who they're buying it from. On the other hand, if the product is highly differentiated, like books or movies or video games, then customers will tend to want to buy from a particular company. And in that case, it becomes harder for any new entrant to get a share of the market because the existing customers will require some higher degree of differentiation in order to be won over to your product. Another factor that affects the threat of new entrants to the profitability of an industry is capital requirements. If the capital requirements are low, then there's a fairly low hurdle that new entrants have to get over. If the capital requirements are high, then there's a fairly high hurdle that new entrants will have to get over. And again, comparing the restaurant industry to the large commercial aircraft industry, you see right there why that affects the threat of new entrants. If customers have low switching costs and if they lack brand loyalty, that will tend to increase the threat of new entrants to the profitability of an industry. Why is that? Because, well, what does a switching cost mean? As an example, think about all of the costs that you would incur if you decided to switch from buying your computers from a Windows platform and you wanted to switch over to an Apple Macintosh platform. Think about all the costs you would incur in making that switch. You'd have to buy new software. You'd have to retrain all your people in how to use this new operating system and this new software. And you'd have to convert over all of your existing data files and word processing files and documents and spreadsheets and everything. So if your company were to switch from buying Windows PCs to buying Apple Macintosh type computers, then there would be huge switching costs, right? And so what does that mean? That means that if you're a new entrant in the operating system business, then it's going to be very difficult for you to attract new customers, because for those new customers to switch over to your new operating system, they have to pay a large switching cost. And that creates a barrier for them to buy from your company. And that makes it harder for you to enter. And the same sort of logic applies to brand loyalty. If you're in an industry where there is significant brand loyalty, new entrants will have to overcome that brand loyalty in order to attract demand to their particular product. And that, again, raises the hurdle that they have to overcome in order to enter the industry. Another factor that will increase the threat of new entrants to the profitability of an industry is if incumbents do not control distribution channels or sources of supplies. If your industry incumbents control, let's say, 90% of the world's diamond mines or 90% of the world's aluminum ore, then it's going to be very difficult for any new entrant to get into that industry because you control the key sources of supply. How can they enter that industry? It's much harder for them because they have to go out and explore and find those sources of supply and maybe even create those sources of supply. And the same for distribution channels. If you control access to the customer, then new entrants will have to find some other way to get to the customer, which increases the barrier to entry. Another increase in the threat of new entrants to profitability is if incumbents do not have proprietary knowledge or technology. If all the companies in the industry are using the same generic industry-wide technology, then anybody from outside that industry can simply borrow that technology and use it themselves. But if you, as an incumbent firm, have something that's unique and proprietary in the technology and the knowledge that you're using in the intellectual property, then that gives you some protection. That means that that's a barrier that entrants will have to overcome in order to get into your industry. Another factor is if there are no network externalities. Let me take a moment to explain what network externalities is, and we'll come back to this later in the semester. A network externality is where there is a benefit to a customer to buy a particular company's product depending upon how many other customers have already bought that particular company's product. So again, for example, think about the competition between Microsoft and Apple Macintosh in the operating systems business. The more people who have already bought one of those operating systems, the greater the benefit there is to you to buy that operating system, right? So that creates a barrier to anybody who wants to create a new operating system because they have to win over people from the existing operating systems when, in fact, there are huge benefits for them to stay with those existing operating systems because they can more easily communicate their information back and forth with other people who are on that operating system. So to the extent that an industry doesn't have these sort of network externalities, that makes it much easier for a new company to come into the business and win a piece of the market. Finally, the last factor that can increase the threat of new entrants to the profitability of an industry is if there is no government protection of incumbents through subsidies or regulation of prices and entry. And this is not that common a factor in the U.S., where at this point there are very few truly protected industries anymore. But before the 1970s in the U.S., there were many protected industries, such as the airline industry. The Civil Aeronautics Board of the United States controlled the prices and airfares that airlines could charge and determined which airlines could serve which routes through that regulation of pricing and entry, the Civil Aeronautics Board basically was protecting incumbents from competition. Since deregulation in 1978, the threat of new entrants in the airline industry has skyrocketed. Whereas before, there was no threat of new entrants coming into the airline industry, now there are new entrants all the time, or at least the threat of new entrants coming in all the time. However, this can be more of a factor in other countries, though, because many countries around the world are not as deregulated as the United States currently is. And so there may be situations around the globe where industries that you wouldn't normally think of are fairly well protected from the threat of entry, particularly foreign entry, by government regulation. Before we move on, there's an important conceptual distinction I want to make between types of entry barriers. Basically, there are two main types of entry barriers. First, there are structural entry barriers. And a structural entry barrier is an inherent natural advantage that any incumbent would enjoy simply by virtue of being an incumbent. And these are advantages that the incumbents do not have to actually do anything about in order to maintain. They do not require any ongoing action or maintenance by the incumbents in order to keep them up. So, for example, in the large commercial aircraft industry, those huge economies of scale, which resulted in the large minimum efficient scale of something like 25% of world demand, that is a structural entry barrier. There is nothing that Boeing or Airbus or any other company can possibly do to change that. It's just a part of the nature of the game that you need a large volume of business in order to have economical costs in that industry. There's nothing anybody can do about that. And so that is a structural inherent entry barrier. The second type of entry barrier is strategic entry barriers. And a strategic entry barrier is an active entry deterring behavior that incumbents engage in. For example, preemptively expanding capacity and holding excess capacity so as to deter new entrants from coming in, or what economists call limit pricing, which is maintaining the price of your product so low, intentionally maintaining the price of your product so low that new entrants don't want to come into your industry because it wouldn't be profitable for them to do so. Both of those examples, preemptive capacity expansion and holding excess capacity, or limit pricing, keeping the prices so low that new entrants don't want to bother to come in, those are what we would call strategic entry barriers because they are active behaviors that do require ongoing action to be maintained over time. You have to continue to maintain that excess capacity, which has a cost, or you have to continue to maintain low prices, which reduces your margins. And so the point here is that these two types of entry barriers actually have opposite effects on industry profits. And this is important because remember that the overall point of the Porter 5 Force framework is to understand what affects industry profits and what affects it positively and what affects it negatively. And since these two types of entry barriers affect it in opposite directions, it's important to understand why that is and how that is. Structural barriers will tend to increase industry profits because they keep out new entrants at no additional cost. Boeing and Airbus do not have to do anything to maintain those large economies of scale. They're just there. And so those keep out entrants without incurring any additional cost to Boeing or Airbus. Strategic entry barriers, on the other hand, do require additional costs, and therefore strategic entry barriers tend to reduce industry profits because they only keep entrants out by imposing additional costs on the incumbents. For example, the reduced margins that you have from limit pricing, from keeping prices so low that nobody wants to come in the industry, or the increased costs of holding all of that excess capacity that you're not doing anything with. And so the threat of entrance to industry profits is decreased by structural barriers to entry, but the threat of entrance to industry profits is increased by strategic barriers to entry. And again, because the 5 Force model is focused on what are the factors that will tend to protect your industry profitability, or tend to erode your industry profitability, it's always important to know which type of entry barrier you're talking about. And to remember that the threat of entrance is a threat of entrance to industry profits. So if we're talking about strategic entry barriers, that may keep new entrants out, but it will do so at the cost of reducing the industry's profits.